Welcome to Real Body Talk. I'm your host, Jennifer Kriatsoulis, coming to you today from Radnor Studio 21. On this show, I have the amazing privilege of interviewing experts of all kinds of backgrounds about cultural messaging and mental health issues related to body image in the age of social media. Today, my guest is a true dynamo. Darlyse Lyons is an actress and author and host of the podcast, The Transformational Storyteller. Today, Darlyse and I are going to have a real chat, take a deep dive into multiracial ethnicity and self-image. Welcome, Darlyse.
Jennifer, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk to you. You know, our topic today hasn't been my personal experience. So I feel really lucky to get to talk to you and learn from you and share what you are going to bring to the show today with our viewers. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so grateful that you touched on the fact that this hasn't been your personal experience, because I think, you know, one of the things that we're going to be talking about is what happens at the intersection of race, right? That I'm a multi-ethnic person with a whole multitude of racial identities that get integrated into the one person that I am. And I think often, no matter how someone self-defines racially, often they don't have that experience of being multiracial, multi-ethnic. So I think it is something that we don't talk about very often, and I'm excited to do that.
Oh, good. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to begin by talking about your book, your children's book, I'm Mixed, that has won awards. Can you share about that book and your inspiration for that book?
Absolutely. So I wrote the book, I'm Mixed, under a pseudonym, Maggie Williams, M-A-G-G-Y, Williams with an S at the end. And the reason I wrote it under a pseudonym is because I have written and published 20 books in the adult space, and I wanted to, I know.
Cheers to you, my friend.
Thank you, yes. And so I wanted to differentiate between my adult work and my children's work. But the book, I'm Mixed, is really about my experience growing up as a child with a Caucasian mother and an African-American father, and being able to embrace both sides of I was going to say ethnic divide, but there really shouldn't be a divide, right? So being able to embrace all aspects of myself and not feel I had to choose a side. And so that book is really about that, giving children and everyone really permission to be multiple things at the same time.
Yeah, what an amazing resource. So as a children's book, can you just talk a little bit about the way you presented that information to children?
Yes, absolutely. So it's written with a rhyming scheme, you know. I will not say that I'm just Black, you know, I will not say that I'm just white. I'll be everything, right? And so it's written in very simple language that kids can understand and relate to. And it's written from a position of the girl who is based on me and actually modeled off of pictures of me from childhood. But it's written, you know, from the vantage point of someone who comes to life from a position of self-acceptance and empowerment and loving herself, you know, because that's not always the case, as you know, in our culture. We're not taught to love ourselves, really. Yeah.
So can we have that kind of real, raw, honest conversation now about what was your journey to coming to be able to, like you say, love all of yourself? What are some of the issues that pop up? How do you, you know, from deciding what part of yourself to choose? I remember we had a conversation offset around that. You know, how do you choose parts of yourself based on the messaging that you're getting about what parts of you should choose? This idea of feeling like you're everywhere and nowhere. And then can you educate us about that, share about that, and then bring us around to so how do we embrace all of our selves if we're multi-ethnic?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful, wonderful questions, and I'll do my best to sort of,
I know, that was a lot.
address.
I'm sorry.
No, it was great. And feel free also to rein me back in as I climb up to my soapbox and start
all good.
talking. So, I want to begin by the idea of choosing a side.
Yes.
And I think that is something that people are often sort of like asked to put themselves into boxes, because I think sometimes the world feels more comfortable if it can identify a category for you, right? Like,
sure.
And even beyond the issue of race, like I think sometimes in schools we're taught like, oh, well, girls are good at English and boys are good at science or whatever, or oh, you can either be an athlete or an actress or a creator, right? Like there's not always space to be a lot of things. So I just want to say that that's not exclusive to race. And so part of, I was very lucky, very blessed to have a mother who, even though, my mom is like purely Caucasian, when I was born, she made a point of telling me, Dara, you are Black, you are white, you are all these things, and that's special, and that's unique, and that's beautiful. And so I grew up with the messaging of, I don't have to choose. I can be everything I am, and I can bring that forward. And many of my peers who are also multi-ethnic were not given that message. They were kind of told what side to be on, depending on, the environment that they were a part of. So I just want to say that I think having permission to own my identity early and always has been really important for me, really important. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Right, yeah. But that said, my mom didn't understand. I have curly hair, this sort of big, massive curly hair. And my mom didn't know how to do it. she just didn't know how to do it. So I have many a childhood story of her setting my hair on fire, in high school, she or I guess it was before high school, she chopped my hair off because she didn't know. So there are certain things that I feel like I didn't quite get the education or the experience that I might have gotten if I had more of a multicultural experience. I had permission to be part of all cultures, but I didn't necessarily experience all aspects of my culture.
Gotcha. That's a really interesting differentiating point. So what would be some of those aspects, cultural aspects, that would make that well-rounded experience?
Yeah, so I think, being exposed to different types of cuisine would have been nice. I wasn't, partially though I also wasn't really exposed to much in the way of home cooking at all. But yeah, so food, music, messages of positive empowerment. I mean, I wrote this book, I'm mixed, but I think a lot of kids don't necessarily see themselves reflected in literature or in art, right? And so being able to see oh, this is how I look, and someone else looks like me, or even having dolls that were not, when I was growing up, there were either dolls of color that were clearly sort of darker than I am, or there were Caucasian dolls. There weren't multi-ethnic dolls, but there's more and more happening in that space, and I think that's important for people to be able to see themselves and get more of an accurate self-reflection.
How would you say not having an accurate self-reflection translated into your self-image, your body image, anything along those lines?
So one of the things that you have probably talked to your audience about, and I know you wrote a book and you spoke about your experience very openly about your experience of having an eating disorder, and that was my experience as well. I had an eating disorder for many years, and I don't blame culture for that, but I do think it was a contributing factor that no matter how, I was never going to fit into the cultural narrative of beauty, right? Until I reclaimed that for myself and owned, I am a beautiful woman, and I might not look like what a typically beautiful woman, like, you know, according to cultural standards or norms, looks like, whatever that is, right? Like, I don't quite fit into the more, you know, the construct on either side, you know, of like, oh, well, this is what it is to be a woman. I'm somewhere in between, right? And so to be able to not have the experience of having someone to emulate or like certain things goals to reach for, I kind of, in spite of knowing that I was special and like knowing that, I didn't always feel it deep down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about, you know, in school with peers?
Yeah, so in school with peers, I felt very lucky that I kind of belonged to every group in terms of racially, and I went to a very diverse high school. I didn't go to a diverse elementary school or middle school, but in high school it was far more diverse. And I felt like I always belonged really in school, and race never came up as an issue for me. But you know, we spoke before this about how I think sometimes there can be a sense of like internalized racism or stigma that comes up that like I'm not even aware of the ways that it permeated my life because I didn't know better, right?
Can you define that, internalized racism? That feels like a very important phrase. Like they feel like very big, important words.
Yes. So internalized racism, the way that I define it is, you know, I think that many people there's a sense of othering that happens, right? Like I am this way, and anyone who doesn't fit into this construct is other than I am. And that happens quite a lot to people who are minority within, you know, the United States and in other places, but people who are in the minority racially tend to be othered or marginalized, or it's like, well, this is the, you know, heteronormative white American experience, and if you don't fit within that, then, you know, you are different, you are other. And so what happens a lot of times is that if that's the context in which we live, there can be subtle messages of racism, subtle messages of you're not good enough, or you don't quite belong, or, you know, oh, well, you don't have the blue eyes or the blonde hair, or you're not this or that way, right? So it's a whole sort of culture that tends to other people who don't fit within that context. And what happens is, you know, that racism, those racist overtones or undertones can sometimes be internalized in terms of messages of, if I were only that way, then maybe I would be better. Maybe I would be good enough. And I think that happens, you know, in the media a lot of times. Like these young girls are reading magazines about these models who look like, who are airbrushed and this and that, but they're internalizing these messages of, oh, I'm not good enough because I don't look like that. But also, you know, it can be not just based on looks, but like, I'm not good enough because, you know, I don't speak the way other people speak. I don't have access to the same education. I don't have, you know, maybe the same, like my parents aren't of the same culture. You know, there's just a sense of like the shame and embarrassment that can get internalized. And so I guess that's what, when I talk about internalized racism or the process of self-othering, that's what I mean. Yeah.
So how, you know, this conversation, I keep hearing the word divide, right? Which you said earlier, like there's this sense that you're divided.
Yes.
Black or white.
Yes.
Right? And you had the gift of growing up in a home that embraced all of you and didn't ask you to divide yourself.
Right.
But you also admit, like, that's not the norm. Right?
Right.
But this idea of divide, like, and othering, and we're here and you're there, and like there's just this division, right? So there's the internal division, the social division, the cultural division. You know, how do you come out from underneath of that? What are some things for yourself that have helped you embrace all of you so that you're not an other, but or you're not othered and you're not an other.
Yes.
You're a whole human being with, you know, a unique identity.
Yes, yes.
Because we all have a unique identity made of our passions, our talents, our gifts, our skills, our the things that make us us. So how do you go from identifying as an other or part of a divided population to a whole self standing on your feet, taking up your space in the world?
Yes. Well, I love that. And I think your question is sort of two-pronged, right? One is the internal experience of a human being, of integration.
Yes.
And I think to some extent, all of us really need to do that in order to be whole and healthy people. And many people feel divided about a whole host of things, right?
Yes.
And so I think in self-integration, like owning all the aspects of self. And you mentioned that, I'm an actress and I have a podcast, the Transformational Storyteller Podcast, and I do a whole bunch of things. For me, being able to integrate, like, okay, what are all the aspects of me and how do I embody those and empower myself to really be who I am? And race is just part of that for me. So that's, I wish I could maybe have a more like tangible, specific answer, but really being integrated as a human being. And some of the tangible ways that I do that are I journal, I meditate, I do yoga. I'm not currently, but for years I was in therapy. Like I do things that help me to find myself, recenter with who I am and like align behind who I am, how I feel, what I want, like what my vision is, and I really live that, and being a more integrated person just allows me not to feel like I have to choose, I can be fully self-expressed.
Absolutely.
So that's part of it. And then the other part of it, like in a more cultural context, I think things like this are really important because there is this sense of like, oh, well, we can't talk about that, or we can't, I'm here and you're there. And until people start having these kinds of conversations, which aren't always comfortable, but they need to be had, because then we realize like, oh, actually, we're not different. We all have the exact same feelings. Our experiences and how those things are borne out might be different, but like, what common ground can we find?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's that power of shared experience.
Right. And as human beings, that's the whole essence of racism, right? Is it's based in fear and not understanding that we're all the same at our core. And so the more we can understand that and practice that, like, my hope is that at some point we are all mixed, right? Like we are all a multitude of ethnic identities, and yet that unique individual experience and that individual identity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you share, maybe this might be a little too personal, but I'm just curious, maybe rewind years back, but when you were kind of figuring all this out, because I'm sure as a teenager, it got a little mixed up, right? Like, as it does for all teenagers. But like, when you were, this idea of like feeling othered and internally othered, like how did that influence, like, say, like how you choose to dress or how you did your hair or how you, like, your relationship with your body in your journey of coming to embrace your whole self?
Right. Well, I love the word journey because I think it definitely has been that and will continue to be that because the body is always changing, right? Like I don't.
Yes.
Yes. I know. I'm like, oh gosh, now when I sleep, like I'm like sleep deprived. I can't quite bounce back in the same way that I did when I was 20. So yeah. I think it's definitely being able to understand that like self-love is a journey. It's a process. But I also view it as a decision that at a certain point in my life, I made a decision to love myself and to practice radical self-love. And so I do that, and what that looks like has shifted over time, and kind of the resources I bring to that have shifted over time. But once I made the decision to love myself, then I really had to get to know myself. And it's kind of like any relationship, right? Like whether you have a relationship with a friend or a spouse or something, it's sort of like, okay, I know you as much as I can know you now, but I'm going to love you and I'm going to commit to loving you more and more and better and better. And I think that I feel like that's what I'm in. Like, I'm in this lifelong relationship with myself. And once I stopped running from that, because I spent years like running from myself or not wanting to get to know myself. But when I said like, okay, let me commit to me, that was really when things started to shift and integration just became like inevitable.
So there was less of that internal divide and feeling like you had to choose how
Right.
you represent yourself, through your body or...
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Well, and then also, I mean, tapping into like, I think there's a way that sometimes we think about the body as this external thing, right? Like, I have brown eyes and, curly hair and long arms, and that's who I am. And it's like, no, once I really tapped into, okay, who I am is like a soul experience. It's how I feel. And I started to live more intuitively and eat more intuitively and all that. Like, I started to like how I looked more, but it also became less important how I look.
Yeah.
If that, does that dichotomy make sense to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
I would love to kind of begin to wind down our conversation, unfortunately, because I feel like there's so many ways we could take this. But for parents who are watching, who can relate to your story, what are some things you might share with them, some tips or advice on how to speak to your child about growing up mixed?
Yeah. Well, one thing that's been really very powerful for me is in writing the book, I'm Mixed, and going to read it at schools. And I've read to parent groups and in all sorts of different environments. And people always thank me because they're like, oh, I didn't even know that could be the conversation, right? Like there's a way that I think oftentimes parents will talk to their kids as if being mixed is like a bad thing. And I think that's a form of the racism that I was talking about. Like, so to really be able to talk to their kids about like, wow, you're like, mom is this and dad is this or grandma is this or what, whatever. Like, and that means that you have access to all these different cultures. And let's talk about what that means and what that looks like and how we might embrace that. That's a different conversation than like, woe is you, that you're other in this way. So I think really for parents to come to the conversation from a place of like curiosity, empowerment, openness, spaciousness, like giving kids the space to have their own experience of race and not necessarily trying to superimpose the parents' experience onto the kids. So I think, just first of all, have the conversation because that's great. It might not be perfect. It might be a little messy. That's okay too. But have those conversations and also, allow your child to have a voice within the space and within the conversation because sometimes I think parents like superimpose this negative judgment onto things that don't need to be painted in that light.
Yeah. So you're saying, focus on what's gained.
Yeah, focus on what's gained. And also, give your child space that if they do have maybe fears or uncertainties or judgments that they're able to express them, but just maybe don't put your judgments on your child in that way.
Right. Yeah. And then maybe one kind of sharing for parents of what they might be able to say to their child who's maybe feeling confused or unsure of him or herself.
Yeah. Well, I would say I love let's, like let us, the word let us. So, and I love curiosity. And so I would just maybe say like, I get that you're confused. Let's figure it out together.
Nice.
And I think sometimes we want to answer our kids' questions, but the real strength comes in like asking them questions that allow them to find their own answers. And I found that more and more in the work that I do with kids. So if the kid says like, I'm confused about this, it's like, well, yeah, what would you need to be less confused? How do we figure it out together? And because sometimes I think we can think that we know exactly what's going on in a child's psyche.
No way.
But it's not. Yeah, but
No
it's
way.
not. Yeah, the kid might be confused because they're just like, oh, I just don't understand why I tan in the summer and not in the winter. You know what I mean? Or why I'm darker at this time. So speaking with kids has really opened me up to the fact that, like, I don't actually always know what issues of race, they want to talk about and address. And so just getting curious with them and meeting them at their level they've taught me so much more than I've taught them. And I think the same is true in any, in any environment. Yeah.
Wonderful. I can't thank you enough for being on Real Body Talk today and sharing about your book, sharing about your life experience, offering, these great tips and hope for people who are, having a similar experience and figuring it out. And I'm really happy that you're feeling like your pulse on society is that there are more images that are reflecting different skin colors and different ways of being, right?
Yes,
and so I think that even though, sometimes living in a hyper-imaged focused world can create anxiety and other things, I think this is one of those positive uses where we get to say, hey, like, we're getting to see what it's like to be, more people are getting to see themselves reflected.
Yes.
And that is so powerful, especially when we're talking about, coming back to the origin of the show, and we're talking about mental health and we're talking about body image, being able to see yourself reflected is so powerful.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad that came out in our conversation today.
Thank you so much. And especially with the mental health piece that, I think it's so important for people to really be able to love themselves and get help and get resources. And so, I think just even in opening up the conversation about race, that becomes more and more available to people. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Darlyse. Thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to seeing you again on the next episode of Real Body Talk.